Well, welcome, everyone. Delighted that you're here this evening for the final lecture in the Herman Lectureship series. But before I begin introductions, I'd like to, we have an embarrassment of riches on this campus in the month of October. Coming up is a presentation of Mr. Darwin's Tree. This is an acclaimed British one-man play, and it says, Mr. Darwin's Tree explores not only science, but religion, the divine intricacies of the soul, and what it means to be human, a real treat. So it dovetails very nicely with this evening's lecture. So this will take place October 23 in the McDonald Big Lecture Hall next door, and you can get tickets at www.gordon.edu/tickets, and it'll cost you all of $5 to attend. So, and you can pick up one of these on a table out there after the lecture today. Thank you. Today's lecture and response marks the final of 3 lectures in this year's lecture series. And we would like to begin by sharing with you a little bit about the lecture's namesake, Dr. Herman. And I was told at the beginning of this that Betty Herman was going to be here just the first night. And here she is with her tribe, all of them here for all 3 lectures. So this is wonderful. I'd also like to introduce my wife, Dolly, who's an artist, a graduate of Gordon College. I won't tell you which year. But if would you stand, Dolly? Thank you. Yeah. Dr. Robert Herman is a former adjunct professor and pre-med advisor at Gordon College, and he taught medical school biochemistry for 22 years at Boston University. In 1981, Dr. Herman left medical education to become the executive director of the American Scientific Affiliation. This is a 2,200 member body of professionals who are interested in integrating the Christian faith with science, with the natural sciences. As a part of Dr. Herman's work with the American Scientific Affiliation, he met Sir John Templeton, with whom Dr. Herman collaborated to write several books, also wrote a biography of Sir John as well. We are grateful that the very same John Templeton Foundation is one of the key sponsors of this lecture series. We will hear from our Herman lecture speaker in a moment, and I'll introduce him. But following the lecture, we'll hear a response from a colleague in the field of the natural sciences. And then finally, we will proceed to question and answer session. And I've been told by Hannah that we have a little more time tonight. So hopefully you'll get a chance to have your question asked and answered. It's now my privilege to introduce the 2019 Herman Lecture Series speaker. Dr. Praveen Sethupathy is an associate professor of biomedical sciences and director of the Center for Genomics at Cornell University, where he directs a research lab focused on genomic approaches to understanding human health and disease. He received his BA from Cornell University and his PhD in genomics from the University of Pennsylvania. And after completing a postdoctoral fellowship under the mentorship of Dr. Francis Collins, he moved in 2011 to the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. That same year, he was elected by Genome Technology as one of the nation's top 25 rising young investigators in genomics. In 2017, he returned to Cornell University as an associate professor. Praveen has authored over 900 peer-reviewed publications in scientific journals and has served as the reviewer of other people's work in 35 different journals. Recent honors include a Faculty Merit Award for outstanding teaching and mentoring, and the prestigious American Diabetes Association Pathway to Stop Diabetes Research Accelerator, which is awarded to only 3 people in each year. Praveen has been an invited speaker for the Veritas Forum, also on the advisory board of AAAS Dialogues on Science, Ethics, and Religion, and serves on the board of directors of BioLogos Foundation, which seeks to convey in its work, convey harmony between science and faith. He lives in Ithaca, New York, with his wife and 3 children, a boy, a girl, and a boy. Correct. Okay. Welcome again, Dr. Sethupathy.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Malcolm, again, for that kind introduction. I'm sorry that you had to do it 3 times, but that's the last time, I think. So thanks to all of you. It's really a pleasure to see so many of you in the audience today. I hope it's at least a little bit of a reflection of the enjoyment you've had in the previous 2 lectures. Let me start by saying a few thank yous. Please bear with me. This is possibly the most important part for me. Okay, this has been an extraordinarily enjoyable time for me. So each of the previous evenings, I've started by saying thank you and how much of an honor it's been, but each time I feel it even more, so you'll just have to bear with me. It has really been a tremendous time. Particularly, I think the most enjoyable part has been interacting with students, the opportunity to get into the classrooms, hear the questions that the students have, their thoughts, their ideas. I'm extraordinarily impressed with the Gordon community, and I was telling one of the classes today, I hope you feel honored and privileged to be a part of the Gordon community, because I've been impressed. So thank you to Gordon. Thank you for this honor, for inviting me to spend the last few days with you. It's been very special for me. I know I'll remember it for a long time. Thank you in particular to the Center for Faith and Inquiry. It is a bummer that Dr. Barker is not able to join us over these last 3 days, but I hope he'll have an opportunity to watch the videos and we can continue a conversation. I want to take the opportunity again, since this is my last opportunity to do so, to thank Hannah Craig. Can we give a round of applause, please? So I've done many of these kinds of events and lectures in the past and have worked with some extraordinarily capable, kind, lovely people organizing these events, and Hannah's at the very top. Right? So you've got someone great in Hannah. I also want to thank Angie and Sharon for their talks immediately after mine as respondents. They were spot on. They did an excellent job of really drawing out some of the really important features that maybe I didn't have the time to or didn't think of. And so I think you picked excellent respondents, and I really learned a lot and was grateful to have the opportunity to listen to them. Today, you're going to have the opportunity to hear a respondent who is a world-class scientist. I have a half a mind to just sit down now and let Ian speak, right? And you may be better off for it, but I'll continue with my responsibility up here. So thank you, Ian, for being willing to be a respondent today. I appreciate your time and your energy and your effort for the community. Finally, before I move on with the lecture, I would like to again thank the Herman family. Not only for Bob and his life and everything that he exemplified that we so value, and for this lecture series, but for the kindness that you have shown in attending each of these evenings. I hope that it's at least a little bit of a reflection of having enjoyed it, and I hope that I'll be able to deliver a modicum of that tonight. So the task before me this evening is to speak on the common ground between science and faith. And woven into that, especially toward the latter part of the talk, will be some reflections on what I believe makes us human. Right? What does it mean to be human? And it'll be from my perspective as a scientist, as well as my perspective as a Christian. I think I've made it clear to you, hopefully you've been able to see my passion and enthusiasm over the last couple of nights, that it's really an exciting time to do science. I think every generation has said something like that, but it really is true. This is an exciting time to do science. I feel as though in many fields, in many arenas, we are just scratching at the surface of what there is to know and discover. And it feels like we're almost right at the edge of a new frontier, particularly in areas like genomics or neuroscience. Many of you, if you were here last night, you viewed a video about how brain-machine interfaces are allowing people who have been quadriplegic for most or all of their lives to be able to move robotic arms with their thoughts. Really, truly exciting things that are transforming human medicine. But in the midst of that, there's another conversation that's happening. There are some who suggest that science is the sole arbiter of truth, and that it's our only foundation for human value and purpose. Whereas others are increasingly suspicious and wary of science because they believe that there might be an agenda among many scientists to marginalize faith. I personally have been pitied by some of my colleagues who view my faith as untested or antiquated, and I've also been perceived as a threat by fellow brothers and sisters in Christ who assume that I'm advocating science as an ultimate answer to all questions and all things. And so I often cornered by both sides into this question of God or science. Sharon spoke about that a little bit yesterday. But I believe that this question is misguided, and it reflects a distorted understanding of both science and the Christian faith. I want to be upfront here that the church as an institution has at best a spotty track record on this topic. Consider the very famous and well-known case of the church's reaction to Galileo's supporting evidence that the sun and not the earth is at the center of our solar system. He was branded a heretic for his scientific views, in part because they were perceived to be in conflict with verses from Scripture that we today, for the most part, would take to be either poetic or observational language. But setting that aside for a minute, if we look at history through the lens of individuals rather than organized institutions, the culture war between science and faith, I would contend, is actually a relatively recent one. Science and faith have actually long been, as I made the case yesterday, productive co-laborers in the pursuit of truth. One very prominent individual, whom I've referenced several times already, is Johannes Kepler, and his life really exemplifies this fact. He's a famous German thinker and scientist, for those of you who are not as familiar with him, from the 17th century, and he established the laws of planetary motion, and is considered among the greatest astronomers and mathematicians that ever lived. In one of his most famous scientific treatises, Kepler starts with the following words. And as I read, I'd like you to imagine a famous scientific treatise today starting with these words. I commence a sacred discourse, a most true hymn to God the Founder, and I judge it to be piety, not to sacrifice many bulls to him or to burn incense of innumerable perfumes, but first to learn myself and afterwards to teach others too how great he is in wisdom, how great in power, and of what sort in goodness. And then it's a whole lot of math. As I said on Monday, Kepler didn't fall into science and then just hope that science and faith could be partners in his explorations and pursuit of truth. He was driven to science because of an insatiable desire to learn about and celebrate God and teach others too, as he said. The scientific lens, whatever it happened to reveal to him, he would not have known ahead of time. It didn't push God out of his worldview. Instead, it gave him a window into just how amazing God is. The larger point here is that there is a richer, though often ignored, history of partnership between science and faith that most students today don't appreciate. Nonetheless, that being said, let's be honest, there are some very commonly voiced issues and concerns that seem to prevent people from embracing the perspective that science and faith are harmonious. There are several of these, and we don't have time to dig deep into all of them. But in the interest of time, I do want to at least just highlight one today, and that's how we think about purpose or meaning. I'm going to talk a little bit about randomness, and you have some experts here in the audience. I know Craig Story actually gave a lecture on the concept of randomness and how that is not in conflict with thinking about God as an author. And so if there are any questions about what I say, I ask that you direct them to Craig. It is apparent, right, that randomness is inherent to many phenomena in biology. And this is often quite unsettling for people. because it seems to suggest that there could be no larger purpose or meaning to our lives. But one of the most stunning truths, maybe paradoxical truths in biology, is that apparently random processes lead to ordered, predictable outcomes all the time. A really compelling example of this is the formation of each of our human bodies in our mother's womb. The process by which each of us develops from a single cell to a whole organism. And I actually had the opportunity to talk about this in one of the classes yesterday. It's been said that our cells play dice en route to becoming a fully formed heart cell or brain cell or pancreas cell. But despite the underlying randomness, at the end of the process, a human body emerges every time. Of course, each of our human bodies is just a little bit different from one another's. I might wish that mine was slightly taller. But it's a human body nonetheless. How does this happen? This has actually amazed many scientists over the years, particularly developmental biologists. And there was an article in Nature several years ago that I think provides a rather poetic answer to this question. If cells play dice, various geometric and temporal constraints on the cells can weight the dice, thus disrupting perfect randomness to convert noise into orchestrated sounds. I really love that quote. You'll have to bear with me. I'm going to read it again. If cells play dice, various geometric and temporal constraints on the cells can weight the dice, thus disrupting perfect randomness to convert noise into orchestrated sounds. In other words, even random processes are constrained by the parameters of the system in which they operate. And these constraints actually help shape the final outcome. Randomness does not have to imply a lack of order or purpose, at least the way that scientists usually refer to it. Instead, these apparently random processes, ones that are governed by some stochastic nature, operating under specified constraints, can actually weave a really beautiful tapestry, like all of us in this room. By the way, as a quick aside, this was exactly how Asa Gray, a Harvard botanist and a devout Christian in the 19th century, felt about Darwin's theory of biological evolution. After critical examination of Darwin's theory, an extensive interaction with Darwin himself, he was a pen pal of sorts across the Atlantic, Asa found evolutionary theory so beautiful and so compelling that he was among the first to galvanize support for Darwin's ideas here in America. And he went on to author a volume of essays, some of you may be interested in checking out, called Darwinia, about the harmony between biological evolution and Christian doctrine. Notably, Asa was not troubled at all by what he referred to as accidental or random processes in nature, because he believed that the creation was endowed with a certain amount of freedom, which would necessarily bring about variation, the very lovely diversity that we see, but all within the sphere of God's overall plan, system, and design. Darwin once wrote in a letter that no one person understands my views and has defended them so well as Asa Gray. Let that sink in for a minute, that the person that Darwin felt best understood and appreciated him and his theory was a devout man of faith and follower of Christ. There may be many different views on biological evolution that are represented here tonight, and that's not even the central point of tonight's lecture. But I do want to take a moment to say that in discussing these things, our goal should not be to convince one another of our position, but rather to sharpen one another through open and gracious dialogue. This is where I think we have been really missing the boat as an evangelical Christian community. It is in that process that I believe we will grow closer to each other and grow closer to God. We may not necessarily have concrete answers at the end of these kinds of conversations, but I think it's in the journey that we actually sharpen one another and draw closer to God, which is really the point ultimately. Darwin did not ultimately agree with Asa Gray's faith, but he held Asa in very, very high esteem and was willing to hear him out on a wide array of topics and challenges, because Asa showed that he wasn't getting his dukes up to fight, but rather he wanted to engage in thoughtful discourse. It didn't mean that he wouldn't be clear on issues where he disagreed. It just meant that his posture was one of graciousness and a willingness to learn, humility. This evening, what I want to do is to provide two concrete ways in which I have found that science actually really nicely harmonizes with the Christian faith. And the reason why I wanted to do that is because we're surrounded by noise that says that they shouldn't be in harmony or that they're not in harmony. And I wanted to leave you with two things that hopefully you can sink your teeth into for ways in which I have experienced that they are. The first is humanity. What does it mean to be human? And the second is beauty. Well, let's start with the first. What makes us human? There's been a long-standing impulse in the scientific community to answer this question with biology. That is, to identify biological features of modern humans that appear to be unique to us. And there have been at least three major iterations of this in the scientific community, if I could simplify it. The first is at the level of behavior. One approach is to look at things like tool making or empathy or cooperation or even trickery, conflict resolution. All of these at one point or another have been suggested as unique markers of humanity, but have since been identified and now even widely appreciated in many other animals, particularly primates, but even species less related to us, like birds and hyenas. The more we learn, the fuzzier it seems to get in terms of how we cleanly distinguish ourselves behaviorally from other animals. Okay, then what if we dig a little deeper? We get beyond the behavioral level and we get to the cellular level. Could we define the human as a collection of human cells, where each human cell is defined by all of its contents, whatever it is? This seems compelling at first, but there's a problem with this approach. One of the most remarkable discoveries in human biology is that our bodies are home to tens of trillions of microorganisms, predominantly bacteria, but not only bacteria. Tens of trillions. This is a staggering number. If you put it in another way, slightly more than half of the cells in a human body are not human at all. These bacteria, living alongside, communicating with our human cells in a variety of different organs, the skin and the gut being two of the more prominent ones. And it turns out it's not just that they're there, but they're actually really important and critical for the healthy functioning of those cells so that we can have normal physiology. And what's even more remarkable is that the environment around us, the things that we're exposed to, our lifestyle choices, our diet, they can reshape the composition of the bacteria in our body. And they can reshape it in a way that they then alter the function of our human cells without impacting our DNA at all. And in fact, alterations in the microbial composition in our body can exacerbate or lead to certain kinds of diseases. So these bacteria alone, they should obliterate a traditional view that a human can be defined by human cells alone. We're clearly more than that. There's this complicated symbiosis with all of these other species that we don't tend to think about having to do very much with humanity. Okay, time to dig deeper. Behavioral didn't cut it. Cellular didn't quite cut it. What about if we get to the genetic level? That's my field, right? So that should do it. What if we defined a human by DNA, the genome that we've been talking about the last couple of days? Believe it or not, here too, we face a rather sticky problem. Littered throughout our genome are genetic elements that originate from other species that we tend to think are completely unlike us. In fact, at least 10%, and this is a modest estimate, of our human genome represents sequences from viruses that have integrated into our DNA. Even at the genetic level, you and I are 1/10 virus, at minimum. What do we do with that? And amazingly, again, it's not just that they're there and that we can be confident that they're there. We seem to have co-opted the use of some of these genetic elements to shape some really important, critical aspects of human biology. For example, there's good evidence to suggest that pieces of viral DNA have dramatically influenced, possibly even driven, the development of the human placenta. This is extraordinarily fascinating to me, right? Viral DNA has helped bring about an organ that is critical for the nourishing of a growing baby in the human womb. What does it mean to be human at the genetic level? PBS was so taken by this that a couple of years ago, they published a Nova Next article entitled "The Viruses That Made Us Human," because our placenta is a little bit different from other mammals. To make it even more complicated, we also, now it looks fairly certain that we have DNA embedded in our genome from closely related species like Neanderthals. And in fact, those of us with European or South Asian ancestry, like me, have slightly more Neanderthal DNA than those, for example, from sub-Saharan Africa. When I told my oldest son about this, he wasn't quite pleased. What do we make of all of this? At the very least, it should certainly make us extremely cautious about using genetics alone to define humanity. The bottom line is, it is not very straightforward at all to define human uniqueness with discrete biological categories. University of Queensland scientist Paul Young recently stated, the boundaries between organisms are a bit more merged now, a bit more shadowy. We need to break down those boundaries. The more we look, the more we find overlap. What he's saying is that there's actually even greater biological connectedness across different species than we might have ever previously appreciated. How does all of this compare with what the Bible says about what it means to be human? To start with, I believe we should be very careful not to read the Bible as though it were a scientific text. The same way we ought to be very careful not to read a scientific text as a theological exposition. But that said, it is rather striking that humans are sometimes described in exactly the same terms as other animals. In Genesis 1, humans and animals are both created on day 6. We don't even get a separate day. In Genesis 2, humans and other creatures are both referred to as nefesh chaya, which is often translated as living soul or living organism. So many Bible scholars have actually argued that even this idea of a soul, whatever that is exactly, is not uniquely human. Also in Genesis 2, humans are created from the dust of the ground, which is exactly the way the formation of other animals is also described. So when it comes to the stuff we're made of, whether we're talking about Genesis or genetics, it seems we cannot escape that there is a fundamental connectedness among all animals, including humans. The book of Ecclesiastes puts it rather poetically. Just as the animals, from dust we came, and to dust we shall return. From a purely material standpoint, I think there's more agreement between science and faith than most realize. So then, according to Genesis, is there anything else that sets human apart? During the telling of how the universe came to be, the phrase image of God is used for only one species, us. The Hebrew word used for image in Genesis is the same word that is used to describe royal images that a king would set up across the kingdom when he was not physically present. Bible scholar and theologian Dr. Richard Middleton, also a good friend of mine, he defines the image of God in his book, The Liberating Image. I encourage you to check it out. As the royal office of human beings as God's representatives and agents in the world. We are called to manifest and to channel the character and the presence of God. Priestly service toward the rest of creation. My reading is that the image of God is not primarily a biological feature. We don't find it in our DNA, but rather a vocational calling that is unique to humanity. In other words, according to Genesis, it is not what we are made of, the material substance, but rather what we are called to, that sets us apart from the rest of biological life. This is an important theological point that may be different in emphasis, but still perfectly harmonious with the claims of science. It does no violence to the claims of science. That brings me to the second point, and that's beauty. I believe it is not only the calling to reflect God's character that makes us human, there's something else. And that something else, I think, is revealed not so much in Genesis as it is in Psalm 104. So we're going to call on that psalm to kind of fit the piece of this puzzle. Most of the verses about creation in Psalm 104, they seem to emphasize the purpose that the created entities serve. So the water is to quench the thirst of the wild donkeys. The grass is food for the cattle. The trees are for birds to make their nests, and the mountains are for the wild goats to make a home, and so on. But one day when I was reading this psalm, one verse stood out as different to me. Verse 26 says that the Leviathan was created simply so it could play in the water. That was really remarkable to me. I had to read it again. I think it reminds us that while part of God's wisdom in creation is indeed order and purpose, another part is simply for the fun and the pleasure of it. I think we lose sight of that. He takes delight in his Leviathan, which he formed apparently just so it could take delight in the oceans. No other larger, grander purpose is written for this. I wondered if that should color the way that I read the entire psalm. So I went back through it. And then suddenly I saw the theme of joy woven throughout. The gushing forth of springs in verse 10. The singing of the birds in verse 12. The wine that gladdens the human heart in verse 15. And the oil that makes our face shine in verse 16. How did I miss all these things? They all make it clear that God makes things not just to satisfy our needs, like hunger, thirst, but also for pure enjoyment. And I think herein lies a core truth of the Christian faith that we often miss, that at the heart of creation is God's joy. All of these debates we're having in the Christian community and the vitriol that we're throwing at one another, missed in all of that is that we agree that at the heart of creation is God's joy. Are we capturing that joy? Are we reflecting that joy? Are we representing that joy? Mankind, as I said, I believe on Monday, is that unique slice of creation that gets to delight in creation right alongside our Creator. We, uniquely, get to peer into and make known what Ephesians 3:10 calls the manifold wisdom of God, and thereby draw nearer to God's joy in the experience of creation. That separates us not only from other animals, but even from angels. For me, at the end of the day, this is a lot of what the scientific enterprise is about. Science doesn't detract from my humanity, it encourages it. It persuades me every day to open my eyes to the overabundance, right, almost prodigal amount of created things all around us. You could spend the rest of your life reading out the different species that exist. The sheer vastness of the created order and the diversity and complexity of created things should be awe-inspiring. And I think they are to us when we're first born and in the first years of our lives. And then what happens to us? It's worth reflecting on. I think we far too easily assume an overly pragmatic and utilitarian view of the world. But actually, it's all there in part, at least simply for us to enjoy, for God to enjoy, and as humans made in his image, for us to enjoy. The idea of taking pleasure in creation strongly links my experience as a scientist and as a Christian. I want to end tonight with two quotes from two very different men. The first is from Henri Poincaré, a brilliant French mathematician and scientist of the 19th century, also happened to be atheist. He said, "The scientist does not study nature just because it is useful to do so. He studies it because he takes pleasure in it." and he takes pleasure in it because it is beautiful. The second was spoken by Jonathan Edwards, the great American theologian of the 18th century. He said, all the beauty to be found throughout the whole creation is but the reflection of the diffused beams of that being who has an infinite fullness of brightness and glory. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, thank you. The respondent to this wonderful lecture this evening is by Dr. Ian Hutchinson. He is the professor of nuclear science and engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. A nuclear engineer and physicist, he was chairman of the Division of Plasma Physics of the American Physical Society in 2008. Hutchinson received his BA from Cambridge University in 1972 and his PhD in engineering physics from Australian National University in 1976. A prolific author on the topics of plasma phenomena and nuclear fusion, Dr. Hutchinson previously served as editor-in-chief of Plasma, Physics, and Controlled Fusion, one of the top 3 plasma physics journals in the world. He's a contributor to the BioLogos Foundation, has spoken at the Veritas Forum on Faith and Science, and is the author of a book called Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles? An MIT professor answers questions on God and science. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here at Gordon again. Let me begin my response to what Dr. Sethupathy has said by thanking him on behalf of the Advisory Council of the Center for Faith and Inquiry for being here at Gordon and contributing so magnificently to the center's mission to show forth for Christians and for the world the mutual integrity of intellectual inquiry and the Christian faith. And thank you also for making your notes available to me ahead of time. I want to respond really just and reflect on so much of which I agree with in what you've said, but from the physicist's perspective. It's sometimes supposed that it's somehow easier for a physicist like me to accept the Christian perspective on the world than it is for a biologist like you. I've never really understood why there's a reason in logic for that. The only thing I can think of is that if it happens, perhaps it's because some Christians reject the idea of biological evolution. Physicists, of course, have less of an investment or involvement in evolution and might not so easily be alienated by that attitude. Evolution's rejection, which is much stronger in the US, by the way, than it is in many other countries. And as you've heard, I've lived in several other countries. And my accent betrays I come from another country originally. It has, nevertheless, a significant and mostly unhelpful history in America. But as we've heard from Praveen, not always so unhelpful, and certainly not receiving always from Christians a sense of rejection. Now, of course, there are puzzles about the way in which certain traditional aspects of theology are to be understood in the context of evolution. But I think that suspicion of evolution in the Christian church has more to do actually with a justified rejection of philosophical and metaphysical extrapolation of biological evolution into a sort of complete worldview, which one might call evolutionism. Evolution has been used by skeptics as a stick with which to beat theists. It's been deployed in various social Darwinisms as a source of alternative morality. And these philosophies have had their influence on theology. But anyway, I don't actually think that philosophical evolutionism itself would explain a difference in Christian representation between biologists and physicists. I reject evolutionism simply because it's bad philosophy. The philosophical and ethical conclusions that its advocates wish to draw just don't logically follow. At any rate, this Christian physicist is entirely comfortable with the idea that God has used the mechanisms of common descent and natural selection to produce the awesome diversity of the world to which you've referred, and the exquisite adaptation that we see in the biosphere. You talked a little bit about randomness. Of course, physicists are very interested in randomness too, and it comes up in a lot of mistaken arguments. You know, the anti-theists of today want to have it both ways. Skepticism in the 19th century was sometimes based on a belief that the world actually has no real randomness, that since the world behaved in their minds obeying deterministic equations of classical physics, that the future was entirely determined, and that therefore God could not be active in the world. Since that time, quantum physics has pretty much undermined that viewpoint for the physicist, because actually it shows that the world, the universe, is not deterministic in that way. The future is more open than was once thought. On the other side, though, the atheistic advocates sometimes argue that evolution, since it involves randomness, can't be consistent with creation by God. And it's a pity to me that some in the Christian community have sort of accepted that argument and based their rejection of evolution on it. You know, neither side of those two arguments turns out to be correct. And when you look at the Bible, I mean, at its simplest level, that it recounts occasions when randomness, such as casting lots, was used as a way of enabling God to guide decisions and therefore to act in the world. And so randomness is not a bar to God's action, and to think otherwise is simply a misunderstanding. I'm also grateful for Praveen's explanation about what makes humanity different, and that ultimately it's not to be found in biology. The stuff of which we are made is not qualitatively different from the rest of the biosphere. And I think that the progress in biology over my lifetime is so astonishing, and I don't want to cast doubt on that whatsoever, but I think, and this is again agreeing with Praveen, it's not a new idea. I mean, even in biblical times, people were very well aware of the biological similarities between humans and the natural world. Perhaps they were more aware of it because they lived closer to it than we do, who live in cities and so forth, far away from farms. I think the issue boils down to what the Bible calls, in its mysterious phrase, God's image, created in God's image. I think that does refer in part to sentience and intelligence. I think it refers also to something spiritual, to a family resemblance that not all creatures share. And I think also Praveen is right in pointing to the representative and vocational aspects of that expression, because the image of God addresses connections between humans and God that are relational. They're not physical. They're relational. They're at levels beyond what we can describe in science through physical and material. And we can rightly call them spiritual. Of course, it's the common experience of all humans to be moved by the beauty of the earth. That beauty often evokes an emotional response when we see mountains or the stars or clouds, or flocks of birds, or rivers, or lightning, or ocean waves, or whales. Maybe Leviathan means whales, we don't know. Sometimes scientists are suspected of being cold because they pursue a rigorous scientific understanding of these awesome and beautiful phenomena. Aren't they undermining the joy and beauty when they seek and find sometimes strictly rational and material explanations? Well, perhaps that can happen, but I think, and certainly speaking to fellow scientists, I think this is well justified, that by far the more likely response for most people is that it increases the awe and appreciation of beauty that scientists experience when beholding nature. By analogy, when a person sees a beautiful painting, if you're uninitiated, you can revel in the sheer visual impact. But someone trained in art appreciation can see so much more of the significance of what is represented by the scene, understand the context of the history behind the painting, can know something about the technology of the paints and the pigments and so forth, and of the artist's art. And so such an expert knows far more about this, and that doesn't remove the joy of beholding the picture. On the contrary, it enhances it. And I think that there's an analogy there. As biology advances, and we understand more and more of the complexity of the natural world, and we gain some control and technological capability, which can be useful, though sometimes it's a mixed blessing, we also can gain, and this may be more important, insight into the awesome and beautiful way that the world works. And that can give even greater enjoyment of the beauty. And the sense of awe and the shared experience of science, of that awe, is common to scientists across the disciplines and across all religious perspectives. But for those of us who intend to know and to love the Creator, it inspires in us thanksgiving and praise to God, whose glory and wisdom is reflected in His creation. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question referring to when you were speaking about the image of God, Dr. Sethupathy. So you emphasized that instead of discrete qualities, biological qualities, you emphasize vocational calling. What would you say, what are your opinions on human consciousness and moral law?
Yeah, those are, human consciousness and moral law was what was brought up as perhaps other features of what might separate us. Right? I think those, consciousness is a very difficult conversation. We could probably have a lecture series just on that. As it pertains to moral law, I think, that argument has been made. Francis himself has made that argument many times. And I think there is a conversation to be had there. But we're learning some really interesting things about the ways that societies are set up among certain non-human primates, for example, where arguments are being made by certain scientists that there is a kind of moral fabric that seems to guide their societal structure. It's not an area in which I have expertise, but I think I'm open to those possibilities. So I've been a little hesitant to go in that direction, but C.S. Lewis has famously talked about the moral law as even something that sort of brought him to thinking about Christ more seriously. So I think it can contribute to the conversation, but I would be hesitant to sort of hang my hat on that. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I ask you one question for him and for Dr. Yan? Is it okay? Yeah, first of all, yes, I do agree with that. we are in the journey to make the dialogue between the two different positions. But however, the Francis Collins, he's very famous theistic evolutionist, and then he's your mentor. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to ask you your personal position mm-hmm. for theistic evolution. So if it is true, what mm-hmm. would be your strong evidences to support that position?
So yeah, that's a great question. That would be a very, very large conversation, and I'm happy to, because the reality is it's an accumulation of, I'll get to that in a minute. I do want to reiterate what Ian so eloquently said, and I think it's worth separating biological evolution, natural mechanisms that might bring about biodiversity that we see and enjoy today, and evolutionism, right, which is an extrapolation from that, a philosophical worldview that has to do with materialism and naturalism, that there is nothing outside of what we can see and touch, right? That evolutionism, by no stretch of the imagination, is required if you hold to biological evolution. Biological evolution does not demand one to take a position of evolutionism. That there are many scientists that do is true, but one does not demand the other, and I just want to make that clear. So in brief, I would say that I am someone that holds to biological evolution as part of the mode of creation that God has used, right? But I wholeheartedly reject evolutionism, obviously, or materialism, because I believe in God as the author, creator, and sustainer of the evolutionary process to bring about life. Right? Now, to your question about what kind of evidence is there, that's difficult to answer in a pithy way only because the way that scientists come to conclusions about models that explain phenomena is through the accumulation of data over the course of many decades and centuries of work that then tells you that one particular explanatory model for a phenomenon is far more reasonable and likely than any other explanatory models that you might devise, right? To the point where it becomes extraordinarily difficult to suggest anything else. Anything else becomes a whole lot of mental gymnastics, right? And I don't believe that God is a God of trickery, right? That he would design and set everything up in nature so that we would come to a conclusion only to say, aha, I tricked you, right? Everything in nature and all of the data that we have accumulated through scientific work points to biological evolution as far and away the best explanatory model for what we see. Right? I think it's worth noting that when Darwin proposed his ideas, the group of folks that were perhaps the most effusive or skeptical about it were scientists. Right? We are not a community that is eager to jump on the newest fad. Right? That is generally not what we are known for. There's an extraordinary amount of healthy skepticism that is present in the scientific community whenever a new idea is put forth. Right? I can vouch for that because we've tried to publish papers on new ideas for which there's an extraordinary amount of resistance simply because it's new. Right? So when Darwin proposed his ideas, the scientific community was not all embracing it. Right? By and large, they were quite skeptical about it, in large part because the mechanisms for what Darwin was saying, he didn't know about DNA, right? So the mechanisms for evolution were unclear, right? But over the years, as his theory was vetted, some of what he said was found not to be quite right, right? He pontificated and speculated toward the end of his book about all sorts of possibilities and didn't turn out to be quite right, and it was the scientific community that adjudicated that, right? But ultimately, the core of what he proposed has turned out to be vetted by the scientific community and serves as an explanatory model for biological life. But that being said, I realize that may be a little dissatisfying. I'm happy to talk further afterwards so we don't take up all this time about specific details that I, for example, find the most compelling. What I can say is that genomics has been particularly powerful in contributing to the evidence.
Okay. Dr. Yan, let me just ask you about the Big Bang. Well, the effort to combine the Big Bang with the creator or the creationism is being attacked by a lot of atheistic scientists or physicians because it seems like too, how can I say, naive or simple. And then they try to develop kind of multiverse or the string theory, something like that. But what if you are asked about the Big Bang? How would you respond that kind of question from the atheist scientist?
Well, in physics, there are some of the same impulses at work as are at work in biology. Some of those impulses are on one side and some are on the other. Those people who are Christians would love to have a scientific proof of their faith. And there has been, within the last 50 years, a big movement within Christianity, especially on the evangelical side, to look for those types of proofs. And one idea is that maybe there's something about the start of the universe that helps us to establish our faith. You know, I think those proofs are unfaithful. I don't think God offers us proofs that are scientific. And the reason why I don't think God offers us proofs that are scientific is because science can bring us so far. Science can tell us that we're in this amazing universe which has the most remarkable stability, power. It's enormous. It's so much greater than we are that it's hard for us to imagine. In a certain sense, that it brings us to a point of minimalistic understanding of God in the sense that many people today take the laws of nature to be all there is, and that, quite frankly, is a form of pantheism. It's making everything that we see God, okay? But what we as Christians believe is that God has interacted with us, humans, and with his creation over history, that he's come in the person of his Son, Jesus Christ, and has revealed the personal nature of God. And that, to me, is what our Christian faith is about. Not just that we have this amazing creation and we can, to some extent, understand it because it's intelligible, but rather that God calls us to a spiritual relationship with him. And that's, again, what I was hinting at when I was talking about the image of God. Thank you for that question.
Could one of you just give a simple definition of evolutionism?
I think we just sort of did it. I mean, it's a handy way. There's no clear, crisp definition of it, but it's a handy way to refer to the practice that is very widespread of taking the observations of biological mechanisms of evolution, which are predominantly natural selection and common descent, and somehow extrapolating that, interpreting that as indicating, for example, you know, that the forces of natural selection should be given free rein in society. You know, that's one kind of social Darwinism. That's an example of extrapolating observations from the natural world and supposing that they imply something about morality and ethics, whereas in fact they don't. And that's just bad philosophy. And I think there are similarities across the board in terms of trying to interpret the world as being purely materialistic. So that's what I mean by evolutionism. Other people may mean different things.
Yeah, and very much so. There's a professor at Cornell, Roald Hoffman, wonderful, wonderful man, culturally Jew, but an atheist. And the way that he puts it is, all there is what there is. And what he means by that is, whatever I can see and whatever we can perceive is all that there is. There is no explanation for it, nor do I need an explanation for it, right? So that's the way that he might put it, for example, if I could be bold enough to paraphrase him.
Thank you guys both for coming. Really appreciate it. I just wanted to bring up something you know, with the statement I am what I am, how God describes himself to Moses. Where does that seek into both you guys' work and what you just stated? Where does that fit in?
perhaps the best place that fits in, if I could jump in, is actually in a conversation we've just been having, right? And that is, can you prove God, right? If we can't even give God a name, right, then I don't think that he is subject to our scientific tools and inquiry, right? I think he's well beyond. I think if we could fully encapsulate God with the tools that we have at our disposal, he would not be God at all, right? And so when I think of I am what I am, right, that's a reminder to me. I mean, that means so many things. We could have a long conversation, but in the context of this conversation, to me, that reminds me of he can't be fit into our constructs. We want a name for something, and we want to put it in a box, and we want to say this is like this. We can't do that with God, right? And, you know, we all have a tendency to do that, and it usually gets us in trouble, right? So the way that it informs this conversation is that it really reminds me that he's far bigger than anything that I could ever imagine, and that he's simply outside of the bounds, at least to some extent, of scientific inquiry.
I quite agree. It isn't that there's one meaning, of course, of that phrase.
Right.
That's a very important implication of it, but there are many meanings.
First off, thank you both for speaking. I was curious, so I've noticed that a modern trend in apologetics, such with John C. Lennox or William Lane Craig, is kind of leaning towards more often a refutation of atheistic beliefs over more classical apologetics of focusing on the person of God. So do you think this is a dangerous trend to be taking in trying to refute atheism as our main focus?
I'll let Ian go first this time.
I'll take this one. First of all, I question the premise. I'm not convinced that is what is happening. One trend that has been very clear over the last 150 years is that in the middle of the 19th century, the Christian church, at least in English-speaking countries, leaned rather heavily on the argument from design, namely that as we look around, we can see the world appears to be designed, and that shows that there must be a designer, a creator. And that was one of the strongest intellectual arguments deployed by the church in the 19th century. That was, by the way, one reason why Darwin's discoveries and theory had such an enormous impact on the church. They got really nervous because they put a lot of eggs into that basket, and it looked like Darwin was in the process of upsetting that basket. So that is one clear trend that has taken place in Christian philosophy and theology, if you like, apologetics, over 100 years. But I'm not sure that I agree that there is overall if you like, a move to the defensive as opposed to, the offensive. I think that there are many people who want to make a very positive case for the Christian message and for its theological and intellectual coherence. And it's certainly part of what the Center for Faith and Inquiry wants to do, is to make a constructive case about Christian thought, and that Christianity makes sense of so many things that have no good answers without it.
Yeah. I'll only add to that, it's beautifully said, just a personal kind of note to that I have a tendency to shy away from that kind of apologetic and focus on the person of God, the person of Christ. That is a reflection of my bias and how I came to Christ, and I'm aware of that. But I'm also aware that some of the greatest minds were swayed by some of these intellectual arguments that were presented, not the least of whom is Francis Collins, but also C.S. Lewis, right? So I think there's room for it. I think we maybe just need to find a balance and have some context specificity in which arguments maybe are going to be the most constructive and productive in what kinds of settings. I think Malcolm has.
Well, as one philosopher, I would just add to that One of the problems with the materialism and scientism and what did we call it? Evolutionism is that there's no place for morality. There is no basis for morality whatsoever in that view. And that's why I think Lewis in Mere Christianity begins his book the way that he does. Many people who read it gloss over that part, but he begins by showing that there must be a moral law, and that's a very powerful argument in leading into what else he says about the Christian faith.
Yeah, Malcolm, I'm actually really glad you said that, because if I could piggyback off of that to connect it with what we talked about last night, right, about Christians and non-Christians alike and the scientific community coming together to have a productive conversation about things like CRISPR-Cas and genome editing. Right? One of the starting points for a discussion, you'll often hear people agreeing and saying, yeah, that doesn't sound good, or that sounds bad, right? And I think it's a really helpful starting point to say, why is that good? Why is that bad? And, I'm not saying we'll necessarily lead to answers and then everybody will become Christian, but the point is that I think that that's a really good starting point in getting people to think about and getting ourselves to think about why do we call some things good and call some things bad? Are those really in alignment with God, who is the one who is good?
Of course, they would say that those terms, good and bad, just are expressions of our emotions. We feel that way, and so we feel some things. But of course, then that doesn't answer the question. The question is, why do we have those feelings? And that's a more difficult question.
And not only that, but also if they're just our feelings, right? Then does it really matter that we come to the table and have these extraordinarily important discussions of drawing lines, which we agree needs to be done? Doesn't seem so. So it must be something more than that.
Yeah, I think that this issue of morality, it can be deployed as an argument for God, if you like, but it also is very important in the kinds of moral and ethical discussions we need to have across the whole society. And so I think I'm rather cautious in that I think it's important to separate those two things. Because if you're going to have a constructive discussion, let's say, of the ethical standards to which we should hold, let's say CRISPR-Cas9 or whatever other new technology it is, we want as far as possible to recruit all thinking and thoughtful people to support this, even though we might believe that they have no basis for their morality. People do have morality. And I know this from my own personal life. My own mother was a believer in no religion, and yet she was a very moral person, and she, was active in good works and in volunteering and so on and so forth. So the people do have morality, even though they don't have a logical foundation for it without a knowledge of God.
Hannah, who's guiding us right to the end, says one more question.
I think there was one over there.
Hi, I just had a question for the both of you, building on that. Richard Dawkins, I think, in his book, in God Delusion, as well as The Selfish Gene, would argue that moral law is the sake of like altruism or inclusive fitness, maximizing the copies. And I wanted to know your guys' thoughts on that viewpoint.
Yeah, altruism is a really fascinating topic in which there's a lot of active research going on right now. There's an individual at Harvard named Martin Nowak. Some of you may know of him. He's a mathematician, but also a believer. And he actually studies kinship selection and altruism and things like that, right? And so he sees no incongruence between thinking about altruism having been an evolved feature and there still being a God who is an author over the process. And so ultimately for me, I'm just going to enjoy sitting back and watching what we learn about the natural processes that may guide features like altruism. Dawkins may not be incorrect about that, right? But again, I see no way in which that suggests that God is not the author of that process, right? So I think we still need to keep reminding ourselves that however many natural explanations we are able to identify, it doesn't push God out. I think part of the problem was Stephen Jay Gould came up with this idea of a non-overlapping magisteria that some of you may know about. Right? The idea is that you've got these two circles that are non-intersecting, and one is natural explanations for things, and the other is supernatural. Right? And he did this, some would suggest, in a well-intentioned way, because he said, I don't want religious people and scientists to fight, so why don't we just say that they're separate, they cover different things, and we'll be on our way. Problem with that is if you've got two circles like that sitting in a box, right, to explain all things, right, the more natural explanations we find, the more it pushes out this circle, right, to the point where it's imperceptible to us, and then we just are, easily falling into the trap of thinking, oh, I guess it's just nature, I guess it's just evolutionism, all there is what there is, right? The whole problem with that model is that that's not how it works. God is not the author of supernatural things, and then there's something else called the natural world. God sits atop supernatural things and natural things. He's the author of both. And that's why I can say that when I discover some kind of natural mechanism for a biological phenomena, it's an opportunity for me to worship, just as much as it might be if there was some kind of a supernatural healing that I happen to witness. Because God's the author of both of those things.
I don't think I should try to cap that. I'll just say that, that I think that, referring to Richard Dawkins, in a certain sense, he's playing defense. He is offering a counter-argument to the argument from morality. How strong or persuasive that counter-argument is, I don't care to get into. What I would say, though, is I am very comfortable in a position of saying none of these, if you like, philosophical arguments are knockdown proofs one way or the other that there is or there isn't a God. Ultimately, I think the discovery of God is what we should be about, and that the way we discover God is through a relationship with him through our Lord Jesus Christ. And that is what Gordon College stands for. Amen.